Hey guys, and welcome to my tutorial on how to set up bullet spread for a shotgun in your game, or really any gun for that matter. So I know there's a lot of tutorials out there for how to do bullet spread for shotguns, and I've actually watched all of them, at least like the top ones, and they're all just very simple and wrong. They do kind of make it work, but they all have things wrong with them. And so there was three things wrong with all of these tutorials that I watched that I wanted to figure out how to fix and then show you guys. So the three things that were wrong in pretty much all the tutorials I watched was that, for one, you'll see when I fire the bullets, you see they actually go inside of the circle. So if I fire it a bunch, you see they fill up this circle. With all the other tutorials I watched, the bullets they wouldn't go in a circular pattern, they would go in a square pattern. So it would end up being a square of bullet holes, and that's because they would do a random X and a random Y. But for my tutorial, I figured out how to make it so that they would go in a circle. So that was one thing. The other thing I figured out how to do is make it so that you could easily change the size of this circle. So you can see I can make it bigger, and the bullets will adjust accordingly and still land inside the circle. And if I make it smaller, they'll land inside of the circle still, which none of the other tutorials I saw did that. They just kind of guesstimated how big the circle should be in the middle of the screen until it looked kind of right. And if you wanted to change it, you were just kind of screwed and you had to figure out how to do that yourself. But for this one, you can dynamically change it. You can actually see at the top left, it prints out the angle that the bullets are coming out of the barrel at. So it's at 25, and then you can go all the way down to 2 degrees to make it super accurate. And the other thing I wanted to show you guys how to do was fix it so that if you change the size of the screen, the crosshair or the circle in the middle of the screen would update and still be accurate. So you can see if I make it a little bigger here. If I scale down the screen, the circle scales down with it, and so the circle is still accurate to where the bullets are going to go. Which again, that was something that none of the other tutorials covered. They just kind of pretended like it wasn't a problem. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you guys how to do was make it so that you could make it so the bullets would kind of cluster in the center as opposed to random. So you can see right now when I fire, they just randomly go inside of the circle. And if I press I, you'll see at the top left, it says bullet spread equals random. If I press I, it changes it to condensed, or like clustered mode maybe is a better word. And so now if I fire, they're still going to go inside of the circle somewhere, but there's a higher chance that they hit in the middle. So you can see I still get some outliers on the edges, but a majority of the bullets go to the middle. So if I spam it, it'll be easier to see. You'll see the middle is pretty much completely red because there's a lot of them hitting there, but the ones on the outside are, still hitting every once in a while. And then you can easily change it back. And then that's all configurable with a very simple curve that you can set up. So again, there's definitely simpler tutorials out there for this that you can do in like 10 minutes, but they're not accurate and they come with a lot of bugs. So I wanted to figure out, this actually took me a while to figure out. I wanted to figure out how to do this the correct way and then show you guys how to do that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I'm going to do this from scratch. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher and launch Unreal. I'm on 4.25.1. I always recommend being on this one or newer, just so we don't have any issues. And then going to go to Games, hit Next, and I'm using the first-person template. You could do all this logic just the same with the third-person template. I don't think it would be any different at all, to be honest. But I'm just using the first-person one, so we'll start with that. We don't need any starter content, and make sure you have blueprints selected, and I'm just going to call this shotgun tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project. And then while that's creating, we're just going to move this over here so I can reference it. And okay. So the first thing we need to do, because if you run it right now, you can see you have this gun and it fires little yellow balls. We don't want that. So let's click on our first person character and open this up. And I'm going to keep this gun. I'm not actually going to switch it out for the shotgun like I had at the beginning because it's just some random shotgun I downloaded online. It doesn't really have anything to do with the tutorial, but we could delete a lot of this stuff. We don't need any of this motion controller stuff because we're not doing VR. And we don't need this sphere thing. We can delete that. So yeah, it should look like this. You should have just the first person camera, the mesh, and the gun. And then if you compile it, you're going to get some errors because we deleted some stuff, but that's okay. We can fix that. So if we come back to the event graph and we go to the begin play at the top, We pretty much just want to, let's see here, we pretty much don't need any of this, so we can just delete all of this. Compile it again. Yes, okay, so this down here is the spawning projectile. We can pretty much just delete everything except for the fire itself. So we want to keep this. And then, let's see, compile it again, and now we are good to go. So now if we come back here and we press play, you can see if I click, it doesn't actually do anything, which is good because we're going to be writing our own fire code. Okay, one thing we also need to do before we start is we need to get rid of this little crosshair in the middle of the screen because we're going to be using our own. So go to blueprints and go to first person HUD and just delete everything in here because we are going to end up doing stuff in this event receive HUD, but we just want to delete what's currently there because we're going to be adding to it later. All right, so now when you run it, you should have a gun here, and if you left click, it shouldn't do anything, and there should be no crosshair in the middle of the screen. So let's file and save this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to be figuring out how to do is how to get it so that the bullets come out of the gun, depending on which angle you specify. And then the second thing we're going to do is make it so that the circle actually draws on the screen at the correct size. So we need to add some variables. So over here on the left, inside of our first person character, we're going to add some variables for the shotgun. Now, this is just a tutorial on bullet spread. This isn't a tutorial on how to make guns and set up guns. I do have a tutorial on that. If you search my channel for gun system, you'll find that. So for now, I'm just going to put everything inside of the first person character to keep things as simple as they can and try to focus on what's important here, which is the bullet spread. So I'm going to make a variable, and we are going to call it bullet angle, and then I'm going to make this a float, and then I'm going to move it to the shotgun category. So make a shotgun category, and then we'll move it to it. So you can see over here we got bullet spread, or sorry, bullet angle. And then let's go ahead and we can set this, or we can duplicate this, duplicate this and call this starting bullet angle. So this is the angle that the crosshair will start at, and I think I had it at 5 degrees, so let's compile this and set this to 5. And what I mean by this is that, so an angle of 5 degrees means that all the bullets coming out of the shotgun will either be between -5 or +5 for the angle that they come out of the shotgun at. So make sure you set starting bullet angle to 5, and then let's duplicate bullet angle again, and we'll call this one bullet distance. So this is going to be how far the bullet will travel. So if you compile this again, we want to set this to like 10,000 or just some really high number for how far you want your bullets to travel. And then the next one we want is a variable. So we can just duplicate this again, I guess. We want a variable for the number of bullets that come out of the gun. So we'll say num bullets, or I guess they're called pellets. Pellets, I think, num pellets. So we'll make this an integer value, and then you can set this to whatever you want, really. I think in mine I used 50 just so it was easy to see, but I think a more realistic number might be something a little bit lower than that. This is, how many pellets are going to come out each time you fire. And for now, this is good. We will come back and add some more later, but for now, these are all the variables we need to get started. So when the gun is fired, this event will get called, and inside of here, we want to write our logic for firing the gun. So the first thing we want to do is drag in our number of bullets, or our number of pellets, and we're going to do a for loop. So we'll say for loop, and make sure you do for loop and not for each loop. So for loop. And we want to loop between 1 and the number of pellets, because we want to do a loop for each bullet that we're trying to shoot. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to get a random point inside of the circle so that we can randomly have the bullets spread out inside of the circle. And this is where a lot of other tutorials do it wrong. They get a random X value and a random Y value, and then they say, okay, that's the random point. But if you think about that, a random X and a random Y is not actually going to always be inside of the circle, because let's say your radius is 5 and you your random value is 5, 5, well, that's not going to be inside of the circle. That's going to be up at the top right somewhere outside of the circle. So to get a random point inside of a circle, we're actually going to get a random angle from 0 to 360, and then a random distance from 0 to the radius. And we're going to make a little function to help us do that. So over here on the left, let's make a function, and we'll call it rand point in circle. And we want this to take in a radius, so input for a float, and call it radius. And then we want it to output a return value, which represents the point. So add a output parameter, call it it's going to be of type vector 2D, because it's going to be an x and a y value, so vector 2D, and call it just point, I guess. Okay, so again, we want to take in this radius and calculate a random point inside of this circle, and we're just going to assume the circle's at 0, 0, the center of the circle. So the first thing we want to do is calculate a random angle. So let's make a little local variable over here and call it angle, and set it to a float. So to calculate a random angle, it's going to be pretty simple. The first thing we're going to do is drag this in, and we'll say get random float, or get, what is it called? Random float in range. And the random float we want is going to be between 0 and 360, because the circle is obviously 360 degrees. So we're going to get a random angle. And the next thing we want is a random distance from the center of the circle. So let's make another local variable, and we'll call it distance from center. I can spell. So this is the next thing we want to calculate. So to do that, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We want to get a random float between 0 and whatever radius is passed here. So we'll say random float in range. The min is 0, and the max is our radius. So I'm just going to right click and say get radius, and then down here. So this radius is just this radius that was passed in. It's just a copy of it. Okay, and that is our distance from the center. So now we have a random angle, and we have a random distance from the center. So all we need to do is a little bit of trig to calculate what that value is in terms of x and y. So to get that, we can drag in the distance from the center, and we want to multiply this. So we'll say float multiply, and it's going to be multiplied by the cosine of the angle. So drag in the angle and type in cosine, and make sure you get cosine in degrees and not cosine in radians. It should look like this, where it says, oops, that wasn't the right one. Cosine, yeah, sorry, make sure you get cosine in degrees, not cosine in radians, or not a cosine like I just did. So it should look like this. It should say COS and then with a D at the end. If you get the wrong one, it's going to be wrong. So cosine in degrees. And then we want to do the same thing for the y value. So this is going to be the x. So let's go ahead and split this. So this is our x. Our y is the same thing, except instead of cosine, we're going to use sine. So we can just copy this again and paste it. And then delete this guy, and we want sine. And again, make sure you get sine in degrees. Hook that up. And that is our y value. So there we go. This is our whole function. We're just calculating a random angle between 0 and 360. We're calculating a random distance from the center of the circle, which is obviously between 0 and whatever the radius is. And then we're taking the sine and the cosine of those values using some quick little math to calculate the x and the y value. So now if we come back here to our event graph, we can call our random point in circle function. And so our radius, well, the radius of our circle needs to be determined based off the angle that the bullets are coming out of our gun. So again, we can use some trigonometry to figure that out. So if we drag in a bullet angle, if we take the tangent of this, so tangent, again, make sure you use degrees because we're doing everything in degrees here. Tangent of that times whatever the bullet distance is, that will give us the radius of our circle, like so. All right, so now that we have a random point inside of our circle that we want our bullet to travel to, we can do a line trace. So let's right click and say line trace by channel. So our start point is going to be pretty straightforward. It's just the camera's location. So let's grab in our camera. Where is it? Up here, first person camera, and say get world location. So that's going to be our start. And then for the end, we basically want to use our start position plus the camera's forward vector times some distance so that it's really far off in the distance. And then we want to offset it by whatever this point is. So to make things a little bit easier for us and a little bit cleaner, I'm just going to make 3 macros here really quickly to get the camera's forward, camera's right, and the camera up vector. So make a macro and call it camera forward. And this isn't necessary, this is just to keep things a little bit cleaner. So camera forward, camera right, and camera up. So inside of camera forward, just drag in the camera and say get camera forward, or get forward vector. There we go. Get forward vector, hook that up to the output. And then do the same thing for these guys. So camera right, just drag in the first person camera, say get right vector, and then camera up. Same thing, drag it in, get up vector, hook that up. All right, so that'll make things a little bit easier for us. So like I was saying before, we want to, for the end location, we want to go from the start location plus the direction of the camera, which is the camera's forward vector, times some very long distance, which is our bullet distance. And that will give us a point from the camera, but super far deep into the level. So let's do that first. Let's drag this over. So we want to say, vector plus vector. And we want the camera forward, so dragging the camera forward. And we want to multiply this, so float multiply by the by the bullet distance. So this will give us a location, like 10,000 units into the world from our camera. But we want to we want to offset that by whatever our random point is. So let's drag this down here and we'll break it to X and Y values. And we want to add to this guy those values. So we'll say vector plus vector. And then the first value we want to add is the X value. So we want to add the X value, but only in the direction of the camera's right value, or the camera's right vector. So we'll drag in the camera's right, and we'll say float times the X, and we'll hook that up. And then we want to do the same thing for the Y. So for the Y, we're going to use up, since Y represents up in 2D space. So camera up, camera up. And then we'll do, again, float times the Y value. And we want to add that as well. So we'll just hit this little pin button here and add that. And then that is going to be our endpoint. So we will drag that in like so. And then let's turn on some draw debug type, and we'll set it to for duration so that we can see what's going on here. Now there's one thing we need to do real quick before we can play it. So right now our bullet angle is currently set to 0 because we're not setting it to anything. So up here in begin play, we just want to set it to whatever the starting value is. So right click if you don't already have a begin play and say event begin play. So override this, and we just want to say set the bullet angle to whatever the starting bullet angle is, which again, the starting bullet angle we have set to 5, so make sure you have that set to 5. And then we should be good to test this now. So if we hit play, and then we click, you can see it fires some bullets, and they should, if you spam it, they should end up going in a circle, like this. If that isn't working yet, then definitely rewind and rewatch it to make sure you have this set up correctly, because it needs to be working like this in order to continue. So make sure that's working. Another test you can do real quick is say set the starting bullet angle from 10 or from 5 to 10, so change it to 10, recompile, save, and now if we fire, you should see it's an even bigger circle because we've now doubled our angle. So if that's all working, then let's continue. Otherwise, definitely go back and rewatch this, and we'll continue in part 2.